Thank you. Thank you very much for having me, and thank you for the introduction. So I'll just share my slide. So you can, just checking, you can see my slides, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. I'm very excited to talk about our work on in-class data analysis replications. This is joint work with Tiziano Piccardi, who is also a postdoc at Stanford, Jake Hoffman, who is at Microsoft Research, and my advisor, Bob West at EPFL. So I think that in this audience, replication crisis is a concept that maybe it doesn't need much of an introduction, but we've seen how reproducibility rates of scientific publications have raised concerns across a number of fields. And this happens because the publication process itself has multiple weaknesses that influence the validity of conclusions. So in particular, there is publication bias, which refers to the focus on novel, confirmatory, and statistically significant results, which can lead to bad research practices such as p-hacking, harking, which means developing post hoc hypotheses to fit known results, or selective reporting. So recently, I think to make sense of what we as scientists do and what can go wrong in that entire process, Patil and colleagues introduced a very useful framework where they consider key components of a scientific study pipeline. So the framework includes all components all the way from the population that is studied, the research questions, hypotheses, experimental design, all the way until sort of what is actually done. So the experimenter, some data is collected, analysis is planned, and then the analysis is executed. We make some estimates and we make some claims. And we really know that there are replication challenges throughout this entire pipeline. But in this work, we are interested in data analysis replication, which means having different analysts use their independently written code to try to reproduce the same estimates and the same claims, while everything else upstream in the framework is fixed. So it's like same population, same questions, same data, and following the same analysis plan. And it's very interesting because this is sort of minimal replication. So we're not trying to collect the same data again. It's just using already existing data with a different code, but even this can go wrong. So there are replication challenges even here. And so we think that this is one way to try to establish credibility of a scientific findings. So have independent data analysts replicate existing results. However, there are really no incentives to try to do that. So even though researchers are increasingly encouraged to share code and share materials, the incentives are just not there. So when we replicate the work of others, that takes a lot of time and effort, but it doesn't really provide a good outcome, so a publication, because there is a presumed lack of originality. We are just working with someone else's data, and so there is less originality and novelty. And then ultimately, as a result, published replications are still relatively rare across fields, and it's more of an exception than a rule. So one potential solution could be we change those incentives, and could we have someone else perform replications, and could maybe students participate in this process? So the question here is, could data analysis replication be done as part of existing data science instruction? Could we make it a learning experience? Could students even do it? If so, that would be good for students and it would be good for science. And there is also existing literature that tries to argue that universities are really well positioned to try to introduce replications as class assignments, and in that way establish a culture of replication and promote critical thinking. So although this could be beneficial, it is unclear whether it is feasible, and sort of, if so, what different stakeholders involved in this could expect from it. So first, the most important stakeholders are students. So here it is unclear if students are able to perform data analysis replications over a course of a typical class. So would this be feasible? If so, what are the benefits for students? So what do students get from the process? And like, how could we reason about the effectiveness of this as a learning experience? So in this work in particular, that's the main focus, trying to estimate learning experience, which is operationalized as a change of attitude. So we measure attitude shifts, and we try to understand whether students acquire intuitions about the scientific process by replicating work of others. And we focus on discrepancies between what students expect from this kind of exercise and then how it actually goes and what changes in the process. We also try to understand how other stakeholders are impacted. So there are also educators. So there are a lot of open questions around what is required on the educators' end to successfully run data analysis replications. How could data analysis replications be incorporated into large classes? And what should educators expect their students to learn and take away? And also what challenges might educators face? And then there are also open questions around scientists and science and what could scientists expect from this. So could this solution really help benchmark and improve the state of science? Could this paradigm be leveraged to avoid any identified replication barriers going forward? Okay, so to answer these questions, to better understand feasibility, challenges, and benefits of in-class data analysis replication approach, we incorporated replications into project component of a large class. The class was applied data analysis class. It's a master level class taught at EPFL in Switzerland, where I did grad school. So we had around 380 students participating in the class and doing the projects in the groups of 4. They were learning basics of machine learning, data analysis, and data visualization. And in particular, as part of this activity, students are asked to replicate data analysis in one of the 10 papers that we pre-selected. In preparation for the study, we identified these 10 publications, and they had to be suitable in terms of the difficulty of the data analysis tasks. In terms of, we also wanted to have a variety of covered topics, and it was also important that there is data available, but that to the best of our knowledge, there is no publicly available code. Because it was important that students write their own code and do the replication from scratch instead of being able to see the author's code. And then in addition to identifying these 10 publications, we also identified, so a paper has a lot of tables and figures and a lot of numbers. So we identified 2 key figures or tables from each publication that is important to the overall message of the publication. So it could be like a simple plot or a table. You can also think about it as like a key number that is reported in the abstract. Okay, and then the study design was the following. So first we had all students read all the abstracts and rank the 10 papers according to their preference in terms of topics and the covered techniques. Then we did matching of students to papers to optimize the preferences. And then in the second step, once we assigned a paper to each student, the students were reading the assigned papers, and they had to report like a review, a summary of the paper to make sure that it was read. And here the students filled a pre-survey, which measured the expectations and the pre-variables that I mentioned in the beginning. Then in the third step, students replicated the basic figure from the paper, and after they replicated, they filled a post-survey that was contrasted with the pre-survey. So the basic figure had either a simple regression modeling in one condition, or in the other condition, it had counting items and performing statistical tests. Whereas the advanced figure that was replicated in the fourth step had a bit more complex data analysis building on top of that simpler one. And then again, after the fourth step, students again filled the post-survey. And then I also wanted to mention that in these pre and post surveys, we also had control papers that students didn't replicate, so they didn't work on those papers. And one was of the same type, the other one was of the different type, and they served as control to keep track of attitudes also for papers that are not being replicated. And then the primary hypotheses that we made were about the basic figure, but I'll also mention the more advanced figure. Okay, and then the main research question sort of was, what is the impact of the students? What do students learn in the process, and how large are the discrepancies between pre and post? So between students' expectations and the reality of their analysis replication. And so why do we care about this? We were interested in this since any discrepancies can be a proxy of shifts in students' attitudes and sort of the aha moment. This is more complicated than I expected. Okay. So the concrete hypothesis we had in mind and that we then tested pre and post to compare were regarding the time. So first, the time that it takes to perform the data analysis replication. Then second, regarding how challenging it is to do so. Third, we also tested expected versus true distribution of time spent across core activities, data wrangling, so pre-processing and reshaping the data, doing the actual data analysis, and data interpretation where claims are being made from the numbers. And then the fourth one was about the outcome of the replication task, where the replication can be unsuccessful, completely successful, or a qualitative replication where findings are not replicated to the exact number, but qualitatively they are. And in the spirit of replicability, we pre-registered this study. So we pre-registered the questions, the hypothesis, and the analysis plan that will be followed. Okay, so I'll describe some of the highlights of the results. And so first, regarding the time that it takes to perform the data analysis replication, we found that students on average underestimated the time that it would take to reproduce the basic figure. So on average, it was expected that replication would take 9 hours, but then it took 1 hour and 30 minutes more. But then on median, there is an even larger gap where on median, the expectation was to take 5 hours, but then on median, it took 8 hours. And we can see sort of the shift in this visualization where on x-axis we have the hours, on y-axis the students, and the post-survey, so the reports of how long it actually took are shifted to the right compared to the pre-survey in blue. Then the second question was about how challenging it is. And here, interestingly, so even though it took longer, we found that students on average found the data analysis replication to be less challenging than expected, which might be counterintuitive. So here again, on x-axis is the score on the Likert scale, and the orange, the post-survey, is shifted to the left. Then we looked at the time allocation across the core activities, which I think explains to some degree this counterintuitive finding. So when it comes to data wrangling, like understanding data structure, performing pre-processing and feature engineering, it took less time than expected in the relative rank, whereas doing the actual data analysis, like performing data analysis, statistical tests, developing training models, evaluating performance, as well as interpretation, where the results are evaluated and compared with the results in the paper, took more time than expected. And so here we looked at, additionally, we did some exploratory analysis of the survey responses provided by students. And then we understood that there is this kind of iterative process where you do data analysis, you interpret, but then it's different. Then you do data analysis again and you interpret again. So you iteratively move back and forward between analysis and interpretation, which is not necessarily challenging, but it's time consuming. Okay, and then finally, regarding the outcome of the replication task, we saw no statistically significant change between what students expected and how the replication attempts worked out. So students did expect the most likely outcome to be qualitative replication. And indeed, that is what happened with the basic figure. The second most frequent outcome was exact replication, and complete failures were relatively rare. And this is also probably because we pre-selected the 10 publications, knowing that qualitative replication is feasible because we didn't want to expose students to stress and frustration. Okay, then I mentioned that when performing the replication tasks, we also monitored for any simultaneous changes in the expectations for control papers. So one control paper was of the same type as replicated, and the other one was of the different type than replicated. And here it's noteworthy that even though these papers were not replicated, there were changes in attitudes regarding those papers. So the expectations were modified in the same direction with the increase in expected time by around 2 hours for both control papers. And this is interesting because it means that there is a sort of spillover effect where you modify your expectations across the board, and you generalize also to type of papers and types of analysis that you didn't work with directly. Okay, and then to complement these previous findings, we also did exploratory studies to try to understand first the challenges of this process, and then second, what might explain the differences between expectation and reality. And so for both, we collected around 2 times 400 open-ended responses that we coded using a grounded theory approach. So we had 2 researchers independently read a random sample of answers and produced topics. So it's a kind of inductive coding where topics emerge. So, and then the topics were compared and discussed until we reached an agreement, and we merged similar topics if necessary. And this was done iteratively until no new topics were discovered, and the majority of the answers were covered. So I'll describe the topics that emerged first for the what was challenging about it question. So here, so students wrote like 2 or 3 sentences to describe what they found challenging. And the four topics that we identified were first, poor description, where, and this was by far the most frequent, where indeed there were some missing details in the original publication about the modeling or data pre-processing. There could also be inconsistencies between the release data and what is described in the article, and true mistakes by the authors in reporting the details. Then students also talked about how it was challenging to do the replication because of their own perceived lack of experience in manipulating and plotting the data or in using some advanced technique. And this was very interesting because it made us think that there are some ethical concerns to this, because it might be that things are really not sufficiently described, but then students felt like it was their lack of experience causing the challenges, whereas maybe it was not, it was just that things were not clear. Students also talked about time requirements, where doing this takes a substantial amount of time, and then this is worsened by the poor descriptions. And then, so one student wrote, it's almost like trial and error and see what will work and test a lot of different things. And then students also talked about limited resources. So some of the 10 papers used large data sets, and that was actually the focus of the class, data science for large data sets. So we made sure that it could be done on a typical student laptop, but students talked about still computation time and how you run something, then you need to wait, and this makes it challenging and time consuming. Then in this second exploratory analysis, we limited only to those students who didn't manage to replicate exactly. And then we analyzed what could explain the differences between expectations and reality. So again, students talked about poor description, like missing details, data issues where there is a mismatch between what is reported and the data. Students speculated that maybe authors made some genuine mistakes, or maybe they tried to embellish the results. This was relatively frequent in 24% of answers. Students also talked about tool differences. So in the class, we used Python, but then in some of the papers, it looked like they were analyzing data with R. And then even though it's like the same test or the same type of model, there could be different optimizers and some small differences in the default parameters, which means that you cannot reproduce the exactly same number in a different programming language and using different libraries. And again, students also talked about their skills and how they improved their skills throughout the semester. So overall, then when it comes to the impact on students, I think the main takeaway is that there were discrepancies between expectation and reality, and there were some changes in expectations about reproducibility in general. So students generalized their attitude shifts from replicated papers to other papers, which we found really exciting. And we also thought that this really matters because any kind of attitude shifts have the potential to foster critical thinking and promote appreciation for all these challenges involved in the scientific process and how it might not be as quick as one might think at the first glance. Then we also, in this work, we were really thinking about what could we report about the impact on educators and any lessons learned that could be useful broadly. So first, we saw that a very small fraction of replications failed, given that students have the right background to do this. And then even when they failed, students correctly identified what were the problems. So students reported having replicated exactly or qualitatively 98% in 98% of cases for the basic figure, and in 87% of cases for the advanced figure, which was great. But this does come at some cost. So we had a large class with 350 students, and there was a lot of, so first there was a lot of logistics around it. So we had to adapt the schedule to to make sure first that we teach the required concept in the right order and that students have all the knowledge before doing the replication exercise. And all of this really added a lot of constraints where, especially for the project component of the class, in the years before and in the years after, we had more open-ended projects where a student would choose a topic, find a data set, do something open-ended, applying techniques from the class. But this entire exercise added constraints on that. And it also added constraints on the prerequisites. Students also needed mentoring and support during the semester, so that also meant human resources. So here in particular, we had 2 TAs dedicate half of their TA-ship to coordinating this, which amounted to around 8 hours per week of replying to messages, making sure everything is going smoothly. There were also certain ethical challenges. So I mentioned this, that if we assign papers that we know cannot reproduce at all, that could expose students to stress and frustration. Also, assigning students to different papers that are replicable to different extent is not fair. And but even beyond that, if we collect any survey data from students in many institutions, this must be approved by an ethical committee. And then there were also changes in grading, and grading had to be reconsidered carefully from scratch to have a fair workload across all students. Okay, and then the third stakeholder in the framework were scientists and science. So what about benefits for science? So first, I think there are both direct and indirect benefits of this effort and similar effort. The direct benefit is reflected in the created artifacts. So we had the students produce 88 online repositories that have replication report, summary website, video presentation. But beyond these direct benefits of the artifacts, there are also indirect ones. So I think that if this is done frequently at large scale, there could be a shift of norms such that popularizing large-scale replications can incentivize new auditing paradigms and incentivize good research practices in general. And then another thing that I think is very useful is identifying recurring barriers to reproducibility and figuring out what can we, as data analysts or researchers or doing any kind of data analysis in our work, what can we do differently to avoid these kinds of challenges in replication. So the major barrier to reproducibility identified is this kind of lack of detailed information. So things can go wrong when model parameters are not stated. We also saw that like random seeds are not stated, so then there is some variation and it cannot be replicated exactly. Specific metrics and baselines tend not to be explained in sufficient detail. It would happen that like in a certain field, there are some norms around what kinds of null baselines are used, but then this is sometimes not described in sufficient detail. Pre-processing steps tend to be overlooked. There are also programming language or library incompatibility, where it is not stated what exact library or what exact version was used. And then that meant that students couldn't reproduce the order of features or specific values. And that's one concrete thing that we can always try to do better when we do data analysis. And then 2 papers had mistakes that couldn't be resolved just by taking more time and trying harder. And this was done on purpose. So we knew that these 2 papers out of the 10 had some failures. So the first one was a paper where there is a cross-validation mistake. So there is a leak of test data into training data when fitting the models. So the cross-validation is not done properly. And second paper has a counting error when counting nodes in a graph. And for both of those mistakes, the students identified them, which we thought was really cool. So it's like there were these issues, these barriers, but students could identify them. And then the last thing I wanted to talk about were creative extensions. So you can scan this QR code to see some of the reports of students' work. So the idea was that in the first part of the project, students did the replication, and so that then puts them in a great spot where they know the data, they did some basic analysis. And then in the second part, students proposed a freestyle extension on top of that. And then they did it, and then they wrote a report about it and made a website about it. So one, and then this was great because it allowed students to do sort of more involved and technically challenging projects. So one that I wanted to tell you about was about, so the original paper was about a Mexican program to replace dirt floors with cement floors, and then seeing the impact that that has on child health and adult happiness, where replacing dirt floors with cement significantly improves the health of young children. And then in this creative extension, the students asked, what about additional confounding factors that were not captured in the regression model, identifying the main effect? And then they used a technique covered in the class, which is called sensitivity analysis from causal inference literature, where we ask if there were some confounding factors that we're not even thinking about, how strong would they need to be to explain this main effect? So here, treatment is cement floor, outcome is child happiness, and then we ask, what about unknown stuff? What about unknown confounders that are influencing both cement floors and the happiness? And then this analysis gives a number gamma that gives insensitivity of the study. And it's really cool because it lets you think about unmeasured variables. And so then for reference, for example, in case of, so we know that smoking causes cancer, and that this is a really strong effect. And then in case of smoking and cancer, if there was some unobserved confounder, it would need to have gamma of like 10 to fully explain the association between smoking and cancer. And so that puts it into perspective how robust a study is. Another creative extension that was really cool was about fitting a different, more complex model on the same data set, and then doing mechanistic interpretability analysis to see how all the different factors could influence the outcome of interest, that is the child happiness. Okay, so the main takeaway here I wanted to leave you with is that incorporating replication tasks into large data science classes really has the potential to increase reproducibility as a natural byproduct of data science instruction, and this can benefit both science and the students. There are also some limitations and open questions that we didn't address. So first, there was this lack of randomization. So the design was before versus after to avoid adverse outcomes. But ideally, so if one cares about what can we learn from doing a replication, we would randomize students into conditions where some do a replication, some don't, and then compare across conditions. But we didn't do that. There is also a question of beyond a single class. So is there something special about this setting and these students, and how could we generalize this? How could we build a cohort where there are a lot of students across universities doing replications? And then there is also the question of what about thinking beyond the pre-selected publications? So how could we evaluate a more comprehensive sample of publications that could be, for example, representative of a subfield that you care about? And yeah, I mentioned this also already, but what about true educational outcomes that we really care about? The skills, and then later what happens in your education or in a job if it involves data analysis. And I think this is something that we are still currently working on. So we're trying to further analyze the artifacts produced throughout the course, such as the creative extension project that I talked about. And then we're thinking about potentially contrasting the year when we did the replication study with the previous and the following year when projects were run differently. And in particular, there were a lot less constraints, so they were fully freestyle. And then the question is whether doing a replication beforehand has any kind of positive impact on the quality and the scope of creative projects, and perhaps a more meaningful use of advanced methods like the sensitivity analysis that I described in the case of the Semaphore study. So thank you so much for following. I'm happy I got to tell you about this work, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Kristina. I'll just stop the recording.